Hello, I'm Chris Krycho, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about music because I wrote, and as of today, you can acquire in all the places Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, all the places a new piece of music called The Desert. It's 40 notes on the piano, well, 40 keystrokes. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but 40 notes because it is a little bit of reflection on the Christian fast of Lent. You see, a couple of weeks ago, I sat down on a Sunday evening because I had this flash of thought in my head. What if I wrote a little piece for Lent? Just a little bit of solo piano, kind of riffing on some of the things you might hear from Arvo Pärt or Henryk Gorky or John Tavener, some of the holy minimalists. And I sat down and mucked around with it a little bit and then thought, okay, I think there's something there. And then Monday night, I sat down and just worked the whole thing out. I pulled up Dorico on my Mac and just worked out the rest of the piece. Took a core musical motif that I had worked out the night before and turned it into something actually coherent and interesting. At least I think coherent and interesting. And then I got up Tuesday morning and recorded the whole thing on that very same piano and sat down that afternoon with my friend Brian LeVay, and he taught me a whole bunch about mixing and mastering, and we did that. And then I put it up in the channels for distribution so that, well, it's out today and you can listen to it, as I said. And I thought it would be really interesting, certainly it's interesting to me, to see a little bit about how the composition actually works musically and to talk a little about what I was trying to do musically with it. And what I hope you take away from this is at just kind of how the composition process works a little bit for something like this. I may do more of these kinds of things in the future to talk about orchestra writing or small chamber work writing, but I think it's pretty unusual to actually get a composer talking in fairly close to real time about how working on a piece of music worked. A good example who actually does do this all the time, and you should go check out, is David Bruce, who makes way cooler YouTube videos than I do and also is a much more successful composer than I am. But in general, I would have loved to have this kind of thing, and I find it inspirational when I do come across it. So I thought, let's talk about it a bit. So for starters, the piece itself is pretty simple. It is 40 notes, 40 keystrokes technically. As we can see here, there are a few places where it's more than one note, but there are a bunch of different versions of this one note, and it just plays through basically a recurring motif and then variations on that motif. And as we'll see in a minute when I'm actually playing it for you, the basic motif here is just a tritone, but with a lot of space around it. You can see here 10-4, 8-4, 10-4, 8-4, and so on. This isn't quite in free time, though I do have a version, and it's actually what I'll be playing from here to demonstrate that is in free time, but it's very difficult to actually read that way, and you'll see that in a moment. The idea here was, and I have this written, played as though listening for what the next note should be. Because that was sort of the experience I had in writing, is I was sitting there at my keyboard and thinking, okay, what should come next? What's the next note? How do I get the sound and the feeling that I want for this piece about being alone in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights? And so the key conceit beyond that tritone motif, which we'll talk through a little bit more in a moment, is that there are just 40 notes across 40 measures. There's an opening measure, which I've actually numbered here, measure 0, and that's just there so that the pedal is already depressed when the piece starts. It doesn't get depressed with the first note, but rather for the first note. And the key here, I wanted to get across that sense of emptiness and vastness and solitude. And so the piece ends up being these long drawn out notes whose bleed sonically continues almost entirely throughout the piece without change. So it opens with this D and then does this first tritone descent, D to A flat, and then from there ultimately resolves down to a G. And it repeats this motif. Occasionally it goes up, a lot of times it goes down. That jump is not a traditional jump in traditional Western tonality. You'll hear tritones sometimes, but it's not the kind of thing that you normally open a piece of classical Western music with. It's also not a standard Eastern piece of music. Although this was inspired by Jesus' time in the desert, I really, really didn't want to do a sort of stereotyped Middle Eastern sound with this. Instead, I just wanted to convey the broad idea here. But I was listening, as I said, for what comes next. And I put that as a notation on the piece that if you want to perform it yourself, you could. This sort of, okay, I'm going to play this note for as long as it should be played. And then that next note to give that sense of openness and vastness and loneliness, but keeping the pedal down throughout, with the exception of, you can see there's a point near the middle of the song piece, however we want to describe it, where there's this short run of just 4/4 measures, very much more normal seeming, and a transition at each of those. It sort of builds into the second half of the piece. You can see this takes us right up to measure 19 and then 20, and then it moves back into the kind of thing we've been seeing before, where having done these, now we're back to these big open spaces. And when we come to the end of the piece, it actually opens even further up, and every note ends up being a longer time and a longer time and a longer time and a longer time, all the way through from 5/4 all the way up to, again, 10/4. And this just gives it this sense of waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. And that's what the Christian fast of Lent is about. It was certainly a part of what the Gospels describe as Jesus' experience of that fast. It's a waiting for something to come. But it also gives you the sense of the desert. And I titled it The Desert, not Lent or The Fast or something like that, because it is that spaciousness and openness that comes with it that I think really gives it the effect I was looking for, combined with the actual tonal qualities here. So I could talk some more about that. I could wax on all day about that, but I thought instead of just bloviating about it, it might be nice to actually just get into the music. So let's do it. Let's see a keyboard and hear a keyboard. So you can see, as I said here, I now have this sitting in the version of it that doesn't have any time, and I'm not going to be counting, and I don't have a pedal here, but I think it'll get across. And if you want to hear, you should just go listen to it on YouTube and Spotify and so on. But the basic motif is this descending tritone. And so here, pulling this up on my iPad so I can see it, so descending tritone and then resolution. And because those are spread very far apart, it's sort of the same effect you might have if I took this piece and said, okay, let's get this on screen so you can see it. What happens when those all blend together? Well, you don't want that sound exactly, but if you let them each ring out first, then the way that it's ringing over the top of that ends up telling us something interesting musically. It doesn't crunch together the way that does, or as the next one goes. That doesn't sound good at all. But if I then you still get the effect of that tritone, which is not the most beautiful sound you've ever heard, but is a very interesting sound. And when you've got that running over the pedal, then it ends up spread out into this, again, lonely, open texture. Now, you can also see that the progressions here are not traditional progressions. So a D falling tritone, then an F falling tritone. The next thing goes from here to here. Again, B flat to A and C sharp. Well, the fact that this is a sort of major tonality, a major third, it doesn't sound major because it just came after a B flat. So now we've got this augmented second from B flat up to C sharp and this minor second down to A. So it keeps it even when there's major tonalities throughout this, and there are a number of them. By and large, because I'm shifting in very unusual ways for traditional Western music, you end up with a sound that doesn't sound major or resolving by and large. And I just kept pushing this throughout the rest of the piece. So here's another non-traditional sound, a B and an E flat. Well, that could function as D sharp, so it could sound like we're stepping, which is not a sound you would get all that often, but you could. But because I've notated it with the flat, you as a player wouldn't be thinking about it that way. And it doesn't, again, because of where we've come from here, doesn't give you quite the effect you might expect from parallel major thirds. The piece keeps on doing this throughout. Okay, now here's a major fourth, but it also sounds very open and strange, even when repeated, because of where we've been coming from. That major fourth is sort of implying this because of what's come before it. Then an F sharp. Here's a rising tritone, and then falling again, and resolving to a B. This just keeps going throughout the piece. There are these interesting points where I do change it up, though. For example, those 4/4 notes I talked about. And the idea here was to give the piece a bit of propulsion and a bit of motion in the middle of it. I didn't want it to feel totally static, and I also wanted there to be these moments of beauty in it, because when you're wandering around in the desert, it's not the case that everything is ugly or distressing all the time, right? It is sometimes the case that you come across a scene of really great beauty and it moves you and it sustains you. That's really what I wanted to do as I came into these points where, okay, now we're just going to, and I've skipped a few notes here. Sorry. So you end up in a tritone again at the end, because this is the piece full of tritones. But you get that motion with much more, okay, deep breath. We can keep going. And the piece runs through this way. Now, the other thing to see here is this actually does visually convey what I want it to. When I show you that the free time, the unmeasured version of it, just has these big open spaces and notes. This is a case where that visual presentation of the media, it looks better this way, but it plays much better this way, because it's much easier to keep track of what the counts are. And the counts do also contribute here, because you never quite know when the next note is coming. Maybe you never know when the next bit of water is coming your way in the desert. In the end, it does resolve into something sort of following the traditional Western system here. It ends with a running sequence that has, and I'm going to collapse the notes together a little bit just so you can kind of follow them musically more easily, but so that's a minor third, that's a major third, and these might go together. Now we're going to throw in a major third. That wouldn't be a traditional progression, but it works. Now one last tritone. It actually descends here and then comes up and then back down. So we get a resolution here that feels more normal and natural, and that lets the piece work as a whole with this big, open, empty, non-traditional tonality, tritone, 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 everywhere, while still giving you a sense at the end of a more traditional resolution that helps you feel like, okay, I got to the end of the 40 days. And getting to the end of the 40 days is part of the point. It's really good, actually, to get through Lent and have Easter at the end and have a celebration. And I'm not planning to write an Easter celebration piece, but then I wasn't planning to write this. I hope that gave you a little bit of insight into what it's like to actually try to take a piece like this from, what if I had some long, slow held notes and maybe tritones, and turn it into something where it's actually a fully fleshed out musical piece. Some sense of progression, an understanding of how the pieces of the musical structure and tonality will fit together, and then ultimately turning that into something that's maybe difficult in some ways musically. Lent should probably be difficult, that's fine, but still takes you someplace that is satisfying in the end. And, I had a lot of fun sitting there at my piano for a couple days and knocking it out. And I want to say thanks again to my friend Brian for helping me with the mixing and mastering. And please go check it out, download it, listen to it. If you'd like, you are welcome to get a copy from me of the music and play it yourself. That would be super cool. Thanks for watching. I'll be back with more videos in the future about music or programming or something else. Hello, everybody. That's a little too Guy Micklemore, isn't it?